This episode is brought to you by oneof10.com.
So today we wanted to talk about thumbnails. Now, both Jamie and Gwilym have a lot more experience in the arena of overall channel strategy, thumbnail concept design, and ultimately thumbnail design. So today we wanted to talk through their processes, see if there are any similarities, any differences, and I had a few specific questions that I really wanted to find out just to learn more about the process of designing thumbnails for successful channels, basically. So to start off, Jamie, could you walk us through what your thumbnail design process looks like?
Yes, I can, George. I brain dumped about 10 bullet points before this call of sort of my general workflow when it comes to coming up with titles and thumbnails for not just this podcast, but for my personal channel and also clients' channels. And at any point, either of you can interrupt with your own questions. But the first thing I do is obviously once the video is recorded, because I do like to come up with titles and thumbnails before a video is recorded, but sometimes I don't practice what I preach and I actually do the packaging after the video has been recorded. And when I do that, I simply just brain dump any titles and thumbnail ideas that I have to add on to any that I may have done beforehand. A lot of this is just things that are inside of my head, not necessarily researched, because I like to kind of be original first and just like get all of my own ideas down on paper before I go and research competitors and other people in different niches that could potentially be interpreted with my own version. Because I think you can sometimes then pigeonhole yourself to a certain style or vibe when actually being a little bit different early on in the process, I think is good. And I've always found that actually taking my own original ideas and then the research that I've done and remixing it in some way tends to come out with the best titles and thumbnails. So that's what I usually do when I'm researching competitors. You know, you have some in your head that are the go-tos. Sometimes I'll ask my client which channels that they tend to look at, which thumbnails that they like. I'll use tools like oneof10.com as well, just to look up videos that are outliers to see if there's any interesting packaging there that works. And I also look at other titles and thumbnails that are working in different niches, because a lot of the times the things that work for different niches will actually work for your niche as well. It's just that you need to like slightly tweak it because, and I'll talk about this in a moment, but a lot of it is the psychology of the packaging rather than just the design. And so looking at other niches that have sort of blown up recently, that can really help with how you package your videos.
I think that point about putting your own ideas down on paper first is super important because, like you said, the other ideas can kind of wash away any interesting little quirky ideas that are coming from your subconscious that maybe you've processed over many years and just are bubbling up now, and you instead go down this really narrow path of, oh, this has worked for them, therefore we should just do a version of that.
Yeah, I find that doing that really does help because it's hard to put your mind back into its default mode before you've been exposed to, you know, all of these other titles and thumbnails. Because if you see something that's really good, you're just naturally going to want to, you know, interpret it and make your own version. So yeah, doing that early on in the process is important. The third step after that is when I like to essentially like take screenshots, add it to something like Figma or Notion and kind of just like collate all of my thumbnails and titles that I like, just so I have sort of like a bit of a mood board that can help me to get creative. And that's where I start to remix and combine thumbnail compositions and styles. And I start to think a little bit heavily about the psychology behind the click of the thumbnails that I think are quite interesting. Because I think a lot of thumbnail designers and YouTubers in general, they tend to just think about the design because they think that's what gets you the clicks. And you see a lot of people do that where, especially new YouTubers who go and hire a thumbnail designer, they find someone who can produce something that looks good. And a lot of thumbnail designers tend to use templates as well. And just because something has good colors, it pops off the screen, the YouTuber has been airbrushed, they have bright white eyes and bright teeth, and it looks very pretty, doesn't actually mean you'll get the click. A lot of the time, it's more like the psychological aspect behind a thumbnail of like how we're using FOMO or urgency or curiosity or anything related to time that makes someone feel like they're going to learn something. A lot of the time, it's about getting someone to click. That's half the work, not the design. And that's why sometimes you can see certain videos on YouTube where it can just be like the default YouTube thumbnail that is just like screen grabbed from the video, and it's super basic. It might be blurry. The YouTuber might be in the middle of talking, but it's got like 10 million views. Those videos work because there's something interesting about it. You know, when you go all the way back to like 2007 and 8, before like thumbnails were really a thing on YouTube, and YouTube was just selecting thumbnails from the videos automatically, and you couldn't change it. There were still videos that got like 10 million, 30 million views, but it's because the thumbnail was just super interesting, or the title was super interesting, and that was what was driving it. And so I always say to people, like, don't worry too much about the design. Like, that's to grab your attention, but then the psychological aspect is really where you're going to get most of your clicks, and that's where you should be focusing most of your energy when designing thumbnails.
Yeah, I've had it happen a few times that we've got a thumbnail designed by a professional designer, and we've also thrown in an A/B test, kind of, let's just get a screen grab from the video, or one of the assets that we got photographed just looks kind of cool by itself, and we just throw it in there, and it beats the thumbnail that someone's been working on for hours to make it look really good, just because, I don't know, as you say, any of the reasons that you mentioned, it's all about psychology. If you, like, I never click on a thumbnail because I think, oh, that's been prettily designed.
Yeah. I think this also applies to things outside of YouTube. Like, if you think about certain songs, some of the most beautiful songs in the world are the most simple. And the lyrics are very simple. They connect with people because there's good storytelling. Whereas nowadays we get this overproduced sort of pop music that sounds the same as every other song. Like calling out Dua Lipa, every single song sounds somewhat the same, but it's very popular and it gets people clicking.
I disagree.
Yeah. Watching.
Poor Dua.
It sounds very, very similar in my eyes, or ears. And so I feel like with thumbnails, some people do, they spend too much time over editing, whereas sometimes simplicity is key. And one of the things I think of when I'm designing thumbnails is something that I call the rule of 3. And this is a rule that can be broken, because I've spoken to people about this before and they're like, oh, I only had 3. And I'm like, you can have 4 elements in a thumbnail if you want. But I find that having 3 is the best, because it's very simple for someone to interpret what's happening in the thumbnail if you've only got 3 individual things. So that might be photo of the YouTuber, some interesting text, and then another element, which might be something in the background, something that they're holding. Maybe it's the piece of tech that they're reviewing, or maybe it's the meal that they're making if they're a cooking channel, whatever it may be. Having 3 elements like that tends to work quite well. And I like to keep that rule in mind when designing, because otherwise you can creep over into overcomplicating, making too much. But as I say, there are thumbnails I've made that break this rule, and they have more, and it still gets clicks. It's really sort of one of those things that the more time you spend designing thumbnails, the more you start to learn about composition, what's too much, what's too little, and you can really start to fill this out. And I think that sometimes for me, that's half the battle, is like communicating this to someone, because a lot of it is the design that you see inside of your eye. You know, it's like there's a feeling and you know what you're doing. It's like if you spoke to a painter and you asked them, how did you come up with that composition? It's a little bit hard because they kind of just get into this flow state and make it. But I say to people, rule of 3, think of 3 elements, keep it simple. And that has actually been very useful for people to instantly make their thumbnails much, much better.
Yeah, I think hearing about that, like, that's definitely something. Again, I've got less experience with thumbnails than you guys, but when I've been talking to people about this stuff, I think of the rule of 3 a lot of the time. And I think for a lot of people, this is a useful exercise in initially stripping everything back and getting to a kind of a base point where, broadly speaking, it's an effective rule. And then from that, you can gradually start to get a sense of what your audience responds to. You might try an extra element one time and find that it works better. But it starts from that place of, okay, your thumbnails are way too crowded. Let's strip it back. And then over time, you can maybe build in these extra elements. You can maybe try these things that technically break the rule, but you're starting from a point of that rule. So yeah, I think it's a really, really useful thing to start off with, for sure. So the way that we find strong video ideas for the channels that we're working with is by taking inspiration from what's already working.
That's why 1of10.com has completely changed how we develop ideas for YouTube.
Just search for any channel, idea, or niche that you're interested in, and 1of10 will scour YouTube to show you which videos in those areas are massively outperforming the rest. You can use filters to see which videos are trending right now.
And then bookmark videos to see them all collected in a single place.
You can even track specific channels to see what's working for them over time.
So whether you're a beginner who's just looking for inspiration,
Or as an experienced YouTuber trying to find the biggest viral trends.
1 of 10 is a game changer for YouTube ideation.
and you can get 20% off your subscription using the code MAKINGIT.
So Jamie, let's say, are we taking this as a situation where you're working with a client who's given you who's said the video is about this, what should the thumbnail be? Or are we approaching it as if you are the producer who is coming up with the video idea and the thumbnail idea all in one?
For me, it's sort of both. I tend to go through this workflow every single time. Sometimes if I'm working with a client on a thumbnail, they typically have their own style. And so that's obviously quite helpful to kind of know certain assets that I need to include in the thumbnail. But if I'm doing something for myself, I'm very much more relaxed. I tend to get creative and see what the outcome just is naturally rather than trying to shoehorn something in.
Let me jump in with some of how I think about coming up with ideas. So unlike Jamie, I don't design the thumbnails myself. Well, I do occasionally in Canva if it's simple enough. So I'm less versed in this, but this is generally how I think about coming up with concepts. So either the idea is coming from the video itself. This is often if you filmed the video before you come up with the thumbnail concept, which you shouldn't do, but sometimes it happens. So, and sometimes you know what the visuals of your video are going to be. So yeah, the first approach is there a standout visual in your video that's, you definitely have to use? So if it's like, I traveled to Nepal to meet the Dalai Lama, the thumbnail is not going to be me getting on a plane. It's not going to be me somewhere in Nepal. It's going to be me meeting the Dalai Lama. So that immediately narrows down all my options to what's the best composition of Gwilym meeting the Dalai Lama that could exist. Presumably we want his face in shot, my face in shot, especially if I'm a known YouTuber. And then I might kind of try and push back against that. So what if it's me like just opening the door to a temple and we don't actually see the Dalai Lama? Maybe that's more interesting. But that's like a starting point. And the second way I approach it, what's a visual that represents what happens in the video, even if it didn't actually take place? So an example of this might be Mr. Beast's private island, right? I gave an island to my 100 millionth subscriber. He doesn't actually he doesn't show the actual island. He shows a fantasy island that has loads of golden stuff on it, but it's enough to capture the person's imagination who's read the title and kind of wants some representation of what might happen in the video. So that's how I work if I'm just going based on what's in the video.
I think that last point around, Mr. Beast having is this the one where he's like hanging out the helicopter and there's like this island behind him with all of this stuff on it? It looks very cartoony.
He's like flying over the island. Yeah.
Like this I think is a good example of like good clickbait versus bad clickbait, because when I speak to people, they hear the word clickbait, and I think this word has a lot of negative connotations. And so, clickbait, they just tend to think, you're falsely advertising the video's proposition. And people click on the video and they don't get what you promised in the title and thumbnail, and then they're frustrated. That is bad clickbait, right? But there is absolutely good clickbait, and that's what we're trying to do every single time that we make a video. Like, just break down the word, right? We are baiting our potential audience to click. That's it, right? But like I said, because of clickbait it always gets used in a negative way, people have that interpretation. So for Mr. Beast, that was good clickbait in the sense that, yes, the island was not exactly real, but the value proposition was true, because as soon as you click on that video, the hook is him hanging out the helicopter, or he stood on the beach talking about the island. It shows that it's a real place, and he does genuinely give that island away. So it was good clickbait, which that particular thumbnail composition is way more clickable than if he had a real photo of him stood on the beach or him hanging out of a helicopter for real. the island in the background would never have looked as good as like the fake good clickbait. So there is this fine line that I think a lot of people get nervous to cross. But when you look at someone like Mr. Beast, who's the absolute top, he does it all of the time. And so I don't particularly think it's a bad thing. I just think that you've got to separate the good clickbait from the bad clickbait.
Yeah, and on the topic of clickbait and showing things that are not in the video, I think it's okay to, in fact, it can lead to more creative thumbnails if you think, so like Brian Johnson, Will My Son's Blood Make Me Younger is a good example of this. The thumbnail is him and his son holding up vials of blood as just plain background and them holding up vials of blood. There are no vials of blood in the video. That didn't happen. But it's not, the audience isn't clicking because they want to see two guys with a blank background holding vials of blood. It's just something that tickles the imagination, and then you watch. And as far as I know, no one has complained about that.
Yeah. I feel like that's the one thumbnail that I designed that I was blown away with how big it got, because that photo was just ended up everywhere on Twitter, in like news channels, and it was just crazy. But you're right, it's such a simple thumbnail design that just jumps off the page. And the title, I think it was like, yeah, I take my son's blood, you stealing his son's blood, and it's just shocking almost. You want to click to find out more.
Okay, so moving back to your system, Jamie, you've gotten the idea, you've got a mood board in Figma. What is of other people's video ideas? Where are we going next? What's the next nitty-gritty step?
So the next step is optional, and it depends on what kind of mood I'm in. But I will typically sketch out the thumbnail design on paper. A lot of people don't do this, but it's especially new YouTubers. And new YouTubers are stuck in Canva, which I dislike for thumbnail creation. And they try to use Photoshop, and it's too difficult for them. It's just very complicated. It's like the best thing that you can do is just to get a pencil or a pen and just sit there and draw, because it's so much easier with your hand to just free flow and try out new compositions very, very easily, which you can then translate to the screen. Try to design and brainstorm inside of Photoshop for a lot of people is difficult. For me, I just like to sort of do something away from the computer. I think actually using physical items to create stuff, it sort of unlocks this level of creativity that you don't typically get when you're dealing with a keyboard and mouse.
Wait, can I just
stop
you for a sec? So when you're sketching things on the sketchpad, how many designs do you usually do? What's actually on there, Jamie?
So I usually sketch out 3 to 5. Sometimes I do more, but I try to limit it to 3 to 5 different designs. I actually have the pad here, which I will describe for our audio listeners. They're very simple. Like, I'm not trying to come up with, a very interesting art piece here. They are like stick figures sometimes they're drawing like this. So like, I'm not sure if you can see this very clearly, but this is thumbnail 1. It's just like a person here. So this is like a YouTuber. I have text at the top, and then I have these 4 squares which represent the thumbnails. And so this is the design for one of the A/B tests that I used in my latest YouTube video. And to the side of it, I just have like alternative versions. And so I just start to write down different text, just to kind of like give me ideas to create these multiple versions of these different concepts. So for example, I have different header text, different YouTubers in the 4 quadrants. So in the 4 quadrants was the 4 different thumbnails. So I've got down Mr. Beast, Ryan Trahan, Fallow, and Diary of a CEO. So these were some of the YouTubers that I mentioned in that YouTube video. And so this just helps me to, like, again, brain dump when I'm sketching. That's all this is meant to be. And then the third one is to remove me and replace with a grid of 6 thumbnails. So essentially remove me or the YouTuber, and then instead of having 4, we would have 6, and we'd have the text at the top. That there is concept 1. And I try to have at least 3 different concepts with multiple variations of each concept. And so I have thumbnail 2, and it's the exact same thing. Thumbnail 3, which is with the workflow design that I had in the actual video, which I didn't actually use because I thought that's not as interesting as YouTubers and their thumbnails. And then I had this fourth version, which is the one that I went with and happens to be the one currently winning in the A/B test. So I'll
Could
go...
you hold that up to the camera?
Say again?
Just could you hold that up to the camera? I'm curious to
Yes.
actually see it. Nice. This is the good stuff. This is also going to be our thumbnail, by the way. You holding the thumbnail
Yeah,
up.
exactly. I can get
thing.
the thumbnail
Yeah.
shot. So yeah, that's typically what I'll do is I'll just spend some time drawing, and it's just a way to quickly get some ideas down before heading into Photoshop, and that's where I can make anywhere between 15 at the minimum, but I would sometimes go to 20 at the high, and it's like 30. That's where I'll go through these different concepts, and there's different designs with things like different colors, fonts, compositions, different power words and phrases that are designed to get someone to click. So like going back to that psychological aspect that we spoke about earlier. And at the end of it, I have, dozens of thumbnails. And at that point, I like to take a step away from Photoshop. I like to give it a few hours or a few days before I come back to it and look at it with fresh eyes. Sometimes I can look at something, I'm like, oh, this is a really good thumbnail. And then I come back to it a few hours later, I'm like, this is terrible. That needs to change. I need to remove this drop shadow. And I tweak things. And after that, I whittle it down even more. And I put that into something like Figma again, or Notion, or thumbsup.tv, or one of the other websites that allow you to basically drop that thumbnail into a fake homepage to see how it would stand out against other thumbnails. And that, before I go on, do you have any other questions on that? Or
Yeah, I do. I think a big thing that is mysterious to people starting out is because they hear people talking about, oh, this is what I do with the photos and different things, but how do you actually get the assets? How do people get the photos themselves of other people, etc., and put them all into one composition?
yes, so there's a couple of things that I do. This is a good question because I didn't really think of that when I wrote down my notes. I spend a lot of time either taking photos of myself if it's a thumbnail for me, or I get my clients to take photos that I think match the positioning of like a competitor thumbnail or a thumbnail that I think works well. I like to work with photos which are made specifically for that thumbnail, and I'm not a big fan of reusing the same photos. Sometimes the client's like, oh, here's this folder, and it's like the same 5 photos that they've used for like the last 20 thumbnails. I'm like, no, we need to go and like create something bespoke. After that, we use something like flaticon.com if I need an icon of some kind. There's a really good website called Yandex, which is what I prefer over Google Images. Google Images tends to give like a lot of different photos of different sizes, and it's just very difficult. Whereas Yandex just gives you like the 4K images almost always. It's really simple, and that's just nice for like copying and pasting assets into Photoshop, like an arrow or something like that, which I can then Photoshop a little bit more.
Yeah, I think something that people underestimate, especially if they're working with, if they're going to be or don't have much experience of doing it, but are working with a bigger creator, is that those people's time is usually very tight. It's so much easier to use templates or ideas that don't require a custom photo shoot than it is to get a custom photo shoot every time. And so, yeah, I think it's a huge win if you are a thumbnail designer, if you can come up with a format, or if you're a producer, for example, if you can come up with a format that means that you don't need custom photo shoots all the time. I think one thing I found works quite well is split screen thumbnails. So this works particularly well for vlogs or anything where you're covering like a long time period. So if it's someone's evening routine, for example, or day in the life of blah, 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 you have 3 images. One is them in the morning, one is them doing an activity in the middle of the day, one is them doing their evening activity. Or if it's my system for, I don't know, working out in the gym, you can use 3 images of them at the gym. And these images can be constantly remixed and put into different compositions until you get stuff that looks really good. And you don't need that custom image of the person who has to go out to the gym, take a photo of themselves in a specific location. But you do need photo assets for that.
Jamie, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree with most of that. The only thing I would slightly push back on is it being easier for the YouTuber to not have to reshoot something, because in my eyes, as someone who works with different YouTubers, I want them to have the best thumbnail possible to get them the most clicks, not necessarily what is easiest for their life. So it obviously would be easier for me if I could just use a template and not have to wait for them to take a special photo that would work perfectly well. But I don't know, I just think it's much better. Like, for example, when I made what I would consider probably my most successful thumbnail, which is Ali Abdaal's skincare routine video, like 8 million views, super close up of his eyes, that you couldn't have got from any other photo. But Ali was very busy, but I still managed to get that photo with him so I could actually go and make the thumbnail that I wanted to, rather than just find a photo of him online, which I could have done and which I did attempt to do beforehand, but it didn't allow me to do what I wanted to do. And so I think it's a balance. Like, I think if you're a thumbnail designer or a YouTube producer, like, even though the YouTuber might be busy, they don't want to do it, it's frustrating. If you can make it as simple as possible for them to say yes and get that new photo that you need, try and do it rather than make your own life a little bit easier.
And one way around this for solo creators as well is, if you plan out several videos in advance, you can do a batch photo shoot for all of the concepts that you have. But obviously that requires some forward planning.
So Jamie, what is the final stage of your process?
Yeah, so there's a couple more things that I do just to put a bow on the end of my thumbnail and title system. After I've created these thumbnails, I've given myself that break just to come back and make any tweaks. I will then go and get feedback from the client or my friends, or if I want to make any changes, that's when I then do it. And then after that, it kind of goes through into the thumbnail A/B testing process. So as I said before, I like to have 3 different thumbnail concepts. And again, these are not small tweaks like different colors or power words. These are 3 entirely different thumbnail styles that look very, very different. And I like to A/B test with them initially when I first upload the video, because when you A/B test, you really want to test the thumbnails that are super different, because whether an arrow is yellow or red or blue, right, is going to be the difference of like 1 or 2% of watch time share. It's not a lot. Whereas if you have completely different thumbnail concepts where, you know, the YouTubers on the left and there's all these thumbnails on the right, compared to 2 YouTubers side by side with thumbnails in the middle and an interesting text, like, those are completely different thumbnail styles. And the difference between the how much people click and watch is exaggerated. So I always start off with that. Whichever is the winner out of those 3 concepts, that's when I then go with the 3 variants. And so that's the minor things, like the little difference in the words or the colors, whatever it may be. And that's where I'm trying to tweak and work out which is the best of that winning overall design. About 2 weeks later is when I then A/B test again. And I do this for a few reasons. The main one is that when you first upload a video, your video is obviously being pushed to a lot of returning and new viewers. And I like to A/B test in 2 weeks after the views have settled a little bit, after the different traffic sources have settled. Mostly because the videos are treated differently depending on the algorithm. So a lot of people refer to YouTube as like, it's the algorithm. Whereas there is an algorithm for browse, and there is an algorithm for search, and there is an algorithm for suggested, etc. And so, for example, your video, if you had a video that was like how to change a tire, okay, that if that appeared on the homepage of someone randomly, not many people are clicking on that through browse, because you're just at home watching TV and there's a video that says how to change a tire, you're probably not going to watch that. But that title and thumbnail would do really well in search when someone is stuck on the highway and they're like, I need to change a tire. How do I do that? So they search. So that video will actually be much higher in search and be getting positive traffic there. And so what you don't necessarily want is to be A/B testing your thumbnails when your search traffic is probably higher in browse when you first upload the video and you've got a lot of subscribers who are naturally going to want to click anyway because they recognize the YouTuber. So there's a lot of factors at work. So I like to do it a little bit delayed, just to make sure that I'm actually validating that this is 100% the correct thumbnail. And I do this a few times. Like sometimes I've done A/B tests like 6 months down the line, and you get a completely different result and the video takes off. So I'm not someone who believes in the first or the second winner. I like to test things out time and time again.
I really like that. It's almost like the difference between phase one is kind of like new shiny thing phase where, like you say, naturally a lot of people are going to be clicking it if they know you. And then it enters the, can we make this evergreen phase? Now it's settled. What is the thumbnail that's going to carry this for the next year rather than just grab them for the first hour?
Yeah, because sometimes there's been thumbnails where the YouTuber is seen in the thumbnail. And that always gets more clicks initially because the subscribers love the YouTuber. And the one where it's just focused on like the object or whatever it may be, doesn't get the views. But then you do that in 2-3 weeks, it's a completely different result. And so it's important to remember that there are multiple factors at play here. And when you do it, it changes things.
So George, after this deluge of information, any questions?
Yes. Thank you both for sharing your insights with me and with our viewers and listeners. I think one of the things that came to mind a few times while we were talking here, and like we mentioned titles throughout, but in terms of the practical steps when you were going through this process, if you can say so, like which of the two has a priority? Are you coming up with your titles and designing thumbnails to fit that title? Or like if you can really only think of a super strong thumbnail in a particular way that then forces you to change the title, like does the thumbnail get priority? How do you decide kind of which leads the other in that process? Do you have a, one that gets that priority?
The super boring answer for me is it depends. Sometimes, usually, my mind casts over the possibilities, and if I land on a really strong title, I will think, I love that title. What's the thumbnail that goes with it? And if I can think of something that goes with it, then that's the process we take. If I'm like, that's a really strong title, but there's no thumbnail that goes with it, often I then go into thinking, so what is the good thumbnail for this idea? And then I land on a really good thumbnail idea and I'm like, great idea. What title fits with that? So it's like a back and forth bouncing, and it just depends on, it's the concept is always comes first, and then it's a battle between good title ideas and good thumbnail ideas to decide which one is going to be the king of this particular video. And sometimes they're both great, and they merge. I think it can be tempting to just go back to what's worked for us in the past on this channel. This thumbnail style works really well, and so does this title style. Let's just like combine those two, and that's fine. But I think it's good to go back to the drawing board every time and just think like Zen style. What is this video about?
Interesting. Okay, Jamie, what are your thoughts on that?
Pretty much the exact same as Gwilym's. I think that titles and thumbnails are all about chemistry, and it's about finding the two that match the best. And you can't really just focus all on titles without considering the thumbnail and vice versa. My perspective on this is that thumbnails are more important than titles because I think people just naturally, look at them when you're on the homepage. They are so big. It's just where you go before you look at the title. But I would say I think titles are underrated. I do think a lot of people neglect the title and put too much emphasis on the thumbnail and spend more time on the thumbnail. Really, you want to do both. And as Gwilym said, you kind of want to go back and forth between the two and try and find the one that works the best. For me, sometimes I'll land on the thumbnail concept and I'm like, that's stronger as just a thumbnail alone than a title and thumbnail that might have better chemistry, but overall has less clickability just because this other thumbnail is so strong. And so it's just like all things YouTube. You can't really just apply this rule and say, this is how you must do it. It's an art form and it's a science. And the only way with this kind of thing is you get better the more you do it and the more you learn what works for your audience. It changes all of the time.
Going more on that chemistry point, I think it's important, generally speaking, obviously all rules can be broken, but to not repeat information one for one in your thumbnail and your title.
Yes.
Ideally,
yes.
one of them is giving different information. So if it's, I trained for 90 days for a boxing tournament or something like that, if the thumbnail is you getting hit in the face during the boxing tournament, then the audience knows that not only are they going to see your kind of grueling Rocky style training montages, but they're also going to see the fight at the end. And that works really nicely because the audience is not going to be disappointed when they get this long story of you training for the fight. And they're also going to be looking forward to the fight when it happens, because that was the image that was kind of speaking to their reptile brain in like kind of, oh, I want to see someone getting punched in the face. And actually, so that's a kind of entertainment example. But in the kind of education, edutainment niche, a thing I see all the time is either the title or the thumbnail promises something extraordinary. So like Johnny Harris does this all the time. A title, for example, is, "This is the most important country you've never heard of." Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more. And then the thumbnail tells me more. And what the thumbnail tells me is it's got a image of Johnny looking kind of curious, kind of looking very seriously at the camera. It's got a map. It's got a red circle around a country. What the thumbnail is telling me is not necessarily different information, but it's telling me that I, Johnny, the creator, has the information to back up the claim that he's made. So he's kind of teasing expert knowledge through his thumbnail. There are loads of examples of this. I think Optimum Tech had a recent video where he said Razer's new keyboard, this is a gaming keyboard, is basically cheating. And then the image is just the keyboard with the text below is something like null 0 or something. So from the title, just like with Johnny, you're getting the information, oh, a bold claim has been made. And then from the thumbnail, you're getting, oh, what's this expert information? I don't know what it means. So yeah, that's my tangent on chemistry between titles and thumbnails. But there's so much more in different niches.
Just talking about this idea of chemistry that's come up, I think that kind of leads to my next question. It's also about thumbnails, and maybe I've now got the answer to this. But like, we've spoken about creating alternate designs, and lots of them, a lot of the time, completely disparate concepts. Are you thinking in these cases like that these alternate designs have to go with separate titles if the chemistry with thumbnail A and title A doesn't necessarily, if the same title doesn't have that chemistry with alternate designs? Are you going in with the idea that, yes, after, the first day or 2 weeks or whatever, I'm going to be switching out the thumbnail and the title because I know that the original title doesn't have that chemistry? And yeah, like, is that the process?
This is where it gets really messy. I don't know about you, Jamie. I haven't got a set system for this, but usually I will be choosing my strongest title, and I will be testing thumbnails that I know work with that title against each other. And then once I have more knowledge about which of the thumbnails works, I might consider running a different test with a totally different title if I've got a title I really like. And just keeping whichever thumbnail I think works best with that title, almost just like a totally different packaging test. And then I will see which of those two complete packages work best, and then follow Jamie's procedure of A/B testing thumbnails. It gets really complicated really quickly.
Yeah, like A/B testing thumbnails is never ending. Like, you could spend forever tweaking your titles. Like, even 5 years from now, there might be, a new trend when it comes to titles that you could change on the video from 2024, and all of a sudden you could revive this once old video. It never ends. It's a process. It's an infinite game. You can go ahead and change thumbnails and titles as much as you want. I tend to lean more towards changing thumbnails because I think they have more of an impact than titles. But as I said, titles are underrated, and I still think people should change them out more. And as Gwilym said, you will have these different packages of thumbnails that work. But I think that the key thing to really understand here with A/B testing is like learning the lessons that you apply to future thumbnails and also the thumbnails that you change from the past, because you will learn certain things about your target audience that work for doctors or for cyclists or for whoever, right? That won't work in other niches. And so you really need to be careful about what you use. Like for some people, FOMO works really well in like finance, but it wouldn't work well in like a medical area. But obviously doing so could result in people disliking your content. So it's really important that you measure these things as you start to take note of the patterns. And not to plug my own YouTube video template, but I have a Notion template that I made recently to help with this, where you actually track like what actually works, what elements work and don't work within your thumbnails, so that over a period of time you can build up a library of previous titles and thumbnails that work for your channel. And this just makes it much easier, because a lot of people always ask me, like, how do you know certain things that are going to work? I think for me, it's just intuition, but a lot of that is because I've done this so much now that a lot of it's internalized. And so creating this Notion template is my way of kind of like getting people to start to write things down. Simply, even if you don't use a Notion template, if you just wrote things down in a notes app, the patterns that you're noticing across multiple A/B tests across all of your videos, that's just going to help you, because it's forcing you to write things, and just doing so makes it stick in your mind a little bit more. And you'll find when you're in that research phase, when you're in the drawing stage and you're sketching things out, there'll be stuff that just pops into your brain and you just know it. And you won't even need to look at your notes, your Notion template anymore. And in my eyes, that's when you've grown as a YouTuber. Otherwise, you're on this hamster ball all of the time of trying to come up with a perfect title and thumbnail. Like, that's draining. A lot of people don't like this title thumbnail process because it takes so long. And people like making the video, they hate the packaging aspect. But it's like, help yourself out and make those notes, and over time that it will actually become more fun for you, or at least gives you stuff that you can give to your thumbnail designer to actually look at and use.
Yeah, I think I have 2 words of warning. First is not to Jamie. I'm sorry, I'm moving on.
Back off. Number 1.
On A/B testing, and I think you can see this with podcast shows that diversify to having random guests on and making all sorts of crazy claims in their titles. A/B testing can take you down the road of, like Jamie was pointing out, going too far away from your brand and what viewers find wholesome and nice, and it might drive a lot of clicks, but it might also end up with you being like that YouTuber who always does whatever it is. I think you mentioned Graham Stefan on another show, on another episode, Jamie, where he's maybe done the "is everything collapsing" thumbnail too many times.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was about to mention. I was like, he had, the world at his feet at one point, and like he was getting a lot of views every single video, and it's because he was using urgency. Buy Bitcoin today, the stock market's gonna crash. What does this mean with this? What does that mean now? Blah blah blah. People were like scared. But when you're invoking this negative reaction of FOMO and urgency in people, it wears off. They realize, actually, I don't need to sell all of my stocks today because a market crash is coming next week, or the housing market is about to collapse. And now you see that his views are a fraction of what they used to be. And, obviously it sucks for him, but you benefited from it, and then it bit you in the ass eventually. So you have to be careful, as you say. You have to be very careful.
It's like taking a long-term view, I suppose, of your strategy rather than the
it's branding.
The quick wins.
It's branding. Yeah. That's all it is. Like it's how do you want to position yourself? And you can position yourself in a way that puts you as the expert, that says, I've got your best interests at heart, and I'm warning you of a crash next week or next month that's coming that's going to financially ruin you, right? It's kind of bad in a way because you're preying on people's insecurities over money, which obviously is a very sensitive subject for a lot of people. And people trust you. Right? You're the authority. But the second you start messing them about and they realize what you're doing, you damage your reputation, and people won't click. So yeah, it's just one of these things.
Yeah, and the second word of warning is to always think that you could be doing something better or different. Just because you've got several formats that work really well for you, titles or thumbnails, doesn't mean that you're probably missing something huge that could work way better if you just change it up completely. Like, I think Thomas Frank posted on Twitter recently about he A/B tested one of his usual format thumbnails. It's just like him, his face next to a screen grab of something to do with Notion, and a sort of abstract image of like a Notion stick figure fighting, I think, a Microsoft Word stick figure or Google Docs stick figure. And the second one just did way better. It was nothing like his usual style, but it was something totally different that clearly worked better. So always be experimenting, I guess. All right, thank you for watching or for listening. If you want more specifics on how Jamie works with clients and how he designed a type of thumbnail and title combination that has got his client Grove Edge millions of views, you can click this video right here.